So our first lecture for our Human Rights in Latin America course is called Human Rights and the Latin American Context. Some guiding questions to keep in mind during the lecture and for discussion this week are: what have been considered the origins of human rights? What role did Latin America play in the human rights revolution? What are the stages of the human rights revolution, and what were the factors defining, quote, revolutionary times and Cold War Latin America? So, human rights, the definition of human rights by the United Nations is: human rights are rights inherent to all human beings, regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion, or any other status. Human rights include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. So historians and other scholars have debated about the moment of origin for human rights as we understand them. The first argument on the origins of human rights, as most notably advanced by Lynn Hunt, is the influence of the Enlightenment and the French Declaration of Rights of Man. The history of rights can be linked to the transitions between subjects and vassals to citizens. The Enlightenment comes in as a pivotal point in which rights become attached to the nation, a period in which the nation itself is being defined and redefined, destined to enforce and maintain civil rights and liberties. A second argument on the origins of rights is by historian Samuel Moyn. Moyn disagrees with Hunt. He argues that concerns of rights and humanitarianism were confined to the nation, and hardly did Victorian individuals in the Enlightenment look to end violence away from their own state. He argues that there were no efforts to create a universal system of rights that challenge the sovereignty of the nation state. Moyn disregards the attempt to find a historic moment predating the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights as the origin of today's understanding of human rights. And he argues that the true moment in which human rights gained traction was in the 1970s, when President Jimmy Carter helped revive the language of human rights as a means to direct foreign policy. The previous neutrality of human rights language allowed for its malleability and politicization by different groups, and it wasn't until the 70s when it really took off the ground. A third argument for the origin of human rights centers on the aftermath of World War II and the post-Holocaust world stage, and it culminates in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Political scientist Catherine Sikkink argues that human rights scholars, pundits, and practitioners continue to assume and to argue that the idea of human rights comes from the global north and is imposed on the south. But the reality is that the global south played a pivotal role in shaping the international protection of rights and democracy. And so we endeavor in this class to prove that human rights have a more complex and diverse history than the ones presented by Lynn Hunt and Samuel Moyn, one in which Latin America plays a major part. So before World War II, Latin America was a laboratory for early experiments in democratic rule and was among the first regions where countries granted their citizens universal suffrage. In the early 20th century, Latin American countries envisioned international laws as weapons of the weak that they could use to balance US power. Two examples were the Calvo and the Drago doctrines, produced by two Argentine jurists. The Calvo doctrine stressed that countries should not use diplomatic or armed intervention to enforce private claims of their citizens abroad. The Calvo doctrine that inspired the 1902 Drago doctrine, forbidding the forcible collection of public debt by foreign powers. These doctrines help prevent powerful countries, most often than not the United States and the United Kingdom, from abusing weaker ones. Though and thus it's no surprise that it came from jurists from the global south. It was not until the period between World War I and World War II that lawyer diplomats first introduced and promoted the idea of internationally recognized human rights. In 1917, Chilean jurist Alejandro Álvarez proposed the idea of international rights of the individual to the American Institute of International Law. Alvarez and contemporary jurists from Russia and Greece were the first to propose such thing as a protection of individual human rights. Other rights were growing in prominence as well. For example, the rights of minority groups. Catherine Sicking, once again, argues that although minority rights can be seen as a stepping stone to individual rights, such approaches were also used as a justification for the forced detention and the genocide of minority populations in order to form a pure nation-state. In The Decline of a Nation-State and the End of Rights of Man by Hannah Arendt, she emphasizes that the events leading up to and during World War II featured the breaking point of any sort of protection of individual rights. She concludes that the limitations of national emancipation led to the creation of a condition of statelessness. To be stateless is to have no rights, no security, no belonging. Some contemporaries made attempts to protect these rights, such as Jewish lawyer from Poland, Raphael Lemkin, who in 1933 proposed that an international treaty be negotiated making, quote, the destruction of national, religious, and ethnic groups, end quote, an international crime akin to piracy, slavery, and drug smuggling. The onset of the war halted efforts to ratify or protect individual rights. Near the end of World War II, a global consensus began to emerge that human rights and democracy would need to be an essential part of the post-war order. Historian Manu Bhagavan has called it a true global utopian moment when anything seemed possible, and stresses that there was virtually unanimous global consensus that an architecture of such human rights had to be created. For human rights, this meant finding an international definition. In 1944, the four great powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the Republic of China, convened in the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. Each of the powers stressed human rights in their war aims, but were hesitant to endorse international protections of human rights through international law and institutions. Empires, such as the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France, did not want other countries to scrutinize the rights of their subjects and colonies, and the United States was concerned about the international implication of human rights protections on segregation in Jim Crow laws. This reluctance questions the role of the global North in the advancement of human rights. So the failure of the great powers to incorporate human rights language from the conference mobilized the NGO community and a group of lesser powerful states, primarily in Latin America, but also the Philippines, Lebanon, New Zealand, and Australia. In February 1945, the Latin American countries met in Chapultepec Castle in Mexico City in the Inter-American Conference on Problems of War and Peace, just before the UN Charter Conference in San Francisco. Most of the Latin American nations in this moment were under democratic rule and embraced the potential for creating an international Bill of Rights and arguing for the need for a community of nations that has rights of its own name, that is not the mere agent of sovereign and independent states. They believed that World War II led to a demand for rights recognized and protected at an international level, and emphasized this necessity of, quote, having an international machinery and procedures to put the principles of the Declaration into action, end quote. Ecuador and Guatemala also submitted proposals on whether member states should take a firmer stand against military coups, by collectively agreeing to deny diplomatic recognition to governments that came to power through non-democratic means. At this moment, the groups supporting human rights in Latin America came from both the Christian right and the secular left. Yet, what determined a regime's support for human rights was its nature. Democratic states tended to support human rights, while authoritarian ones didn't. The San Francisco Conference of 1945 was the largest diplomatic conference to date. It lasted 2 months and included 2,000 delegates, experts, advisors, and secretaries from 50 countries and 2,400 from the media. 18 countries of the global north and 31 from the global south. Of the 31, 20 were Latin American, which comprised the largest regional group. The US also sent NGOs to back the demands for the inclusion of human rights that lobbied the US delegates to endorse Latin American proposals. Based on the prominent presence, we can say that without Latin American protagonism, it is unlikely that the Charter would have contained references to human rights. The Charter contains 7 references to human rights, including listing the promotion of human rights as one of the basic purposes of the organization. The initiatives of the Latin American countries helped extend the economic, social, and human rights objectives. According to Catherine Seekink, the inclusion of human rights language in the founding text of the United Nations was thus a critical juncture that channeled the history of post-war global governance in the direction of setting international norms and law about promotion of human rights. The language adopted was not the language of the great powers, but rather the language of the global south. The Latin American nations made it clear that they supported sovereignty and non-intervention, but also that this had to be subordinated to international law. In May 1948, the American states met in Bogotá, Colombia, to discuss regional concerns, especially the creation of the Organization of American States. There, they drafted the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man, one of the greatest contributions of Latin America to human rights. This draft wanted to combine and balance the individual and communal aspect of human rights, the incorporation of attention to civil and political and economic and social rights. They built upon the existing traditions and constitutions of Latin American countries. Thus, the documents were not an imitation of ideas from the United States or Western Europe. At this moment, the opposition to the declaration emerged from countries such as Mexico. Mexico's initial support was rooted in the defense of sovereignty and non-intervention and a fear of its proximity to the United States. However, a change in the Mexican government aimed to change the language from a legally bound treaty to a declaration. Mexican delegates worried that the international protection of human rights could lead to more, not less, intervention. Thus, some Latin American states were now transitioning into authoritarian governments and becoming more reluctant to implement the international element of the declaration, leaving the declaration's purpose ambiguous. The American Declaration was completed weeks before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and influenced it in regard to social and economic rights. Drafts submitted by Cuba and Panama and Chile included a Bill of Rights referencing rights to education, food, healthcare. Seekink argues that the involvement of American countries in the inclusion of such economic rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights corrects the long-held belief that the economic and social rights in the UDHR were influenced by Soviet pressure. Latin American delegates also contributed to the implementation of the right to justice. For Latin Americans, the right to justice was the existence of judicial procedures that could protect the individuals against the abuse of authority of governments that violated their rights, and it was rooted in the region's tradition. Six delegates in the drafting of the UDHR were women, and half of those were Latin American. Bertha Lutz from Brazil and Minerva Bernardino from the Dominican Republic took the lead in including key wording for women's rights in the Charter. These women were part of the Pan-American feminist movement, which favored the right to vote, social rights for women, labor legislation for domestic and rural workers. Lutz and Bernardino were opposed by women delegates from the US and Canada, and by women advisors from the United Kingdom. The Latin American delegates and the US-based NGOs proved much more supportive of including women's amendments. This in fact challenges the notion of the US initiative in promoting women's rights at the conference, without diminishing the role of Eleanor Roosevelt. Therefore, in the case of the UN Charter and the UDHR, the protagonists were Latin American states, other small states, and NGOs that took leadership in incorporating human rights in post-war institutions. Given the influence of the region in crafting human rights policy, how then can we explain the massive violation of human rights that took place in the latter half of the 20th century in Latin America? A leading historian has said that the Human Rights Project of the 1940s was not stillborn, but it arrived on the international scene without any privileged birthright. In the 20 years after the American Declaration of Rights and Duties of Man, every single Latin American state of the 20 that met at the meetings of the 1940s suffered at least one authoritarian regime that resisted the idea of international protection of human rights. The United States policy towards Latin America also changed during this period. Early after the war, the policy was of containment. The US supported and puppeteered dictators such as Trujillo in the Dominican Republic and Batista in Cuba. These governments argued that their struggle against communism and the preservation of Christian civilization trumped all other issues facing the region. During this moment, the US was determined not to ratify any international rights treaties. The aggressive anti-communist policy of the United States polarized the region. The first CIA-sponsored coup was against Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954. The overthrow convinced Fidel Castro and Che Guevara that only armed revolution could succeed in bringing about change. After the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, the United States' top priority towards Latin America from 1959 to 1990 was to dampen the influence of the Cuban Revolution and its effect in inspiring broad segments of the population, particularly workers, peasants, and youth, to believe that a similar revolution was possible in their countries. During this period, social unrest, the radicalization of politics, mass mobilizations, and insurrections destabilized governments and kept the region in a high state of agitation. While human rights institutions slowed in Latin America, the rest of the Global South took protagonism in the processes of decolonization and organizing of anti-apartheid institutions. Yet, some slow progress took place in Latin America. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, created in 1959, took years to set up and function, but began to receive petitions in 1965. In 1969, the Organization of American States approved the ratification of the American Convention of Human Rights in Costa Rica. 11 states had to ratify it, and given the number of authoritarian states in the region, it finally entered into force in 1978. In the 1970s, the Carter administration was more receptive to human rights and supported the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. This change coincided with increased activism from Latin American human rights social movements. The 1970s were a moment when new human rights NGOs around the world began to use the institutional arrangements that diplomatic struggles of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s had put at their disposal. The agreements, treaties, treaty bodies, provisions for individual petitions, commissions, and courts all served to advance the cause of human rights. NGOs helped inform world opinion through widely shared reports. From these mechanisms, domestic human rights organizations could gain information, support, and legitimacy. While Latin American states found themselves under authoritarian regimes, the human rights movements emerged as a response to these regimes' adoption of neoliberal economic policies and in response to the complaints made by families of these regimes' many victims. Thus, although slow, there was some progress in Latin America, especially progress to advance the diplomatic struggles from the previous decades. A century of revolution. Historian Greg Grandin has labeled the 20th century in Latin America as the century of revolution, spanning from the Mexican Revolution in 1910 to the Zapatista movement in 1994. The century invoked both unlimited possibility and hope, as well as unprecedented repression. Violence in Latin America was perpetuated by both revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries. Grandin advances that both internal and external factors linked majority of the Latin American revolutions in this period. The driving external factor was the state of subordination, mainly economic, to the United States. The internal factors dealt with domestic reactions to the challenge of hegemony and the democratization of society challenged the status quo, therefore driving domestic repression. Domestic repression could not have reached the limits of violence that it did without the consent of the United States. The United States trained Latin American military officers and intelligence agents, inserting them in the counter-revolutionary efforts throughout the 20th century. Therefore, to understand why there was so much violence and human rights violations, it is crucial to situate the context of revolution and counter-revolution. In Latin America, revolutions made and remade the definitions of freedoms, and counter-revolutions exploited the limits of social control and human annihilation. Similarly, Thomas Wright has explained that two forms of terrorism engulf the region: state terrorism and terrorism against the state. He explains, terrorism against the state is designed to force the government to modify its policies, to overthrow the government, or even to destroy the state. The intent of terrorism by the state is to eliminate some or all of the people who are considered actual or potential enemies of the regime, and to marginalize those not eliminated through the fear that terrorism instills. In terms of human rights, he adds, while terrorism against the state may negatively affect human rights, state terrorism extinguishes human rights. Our case studies of Argentina and Peru will follow Grandin's suggestions for studying political violence. We will historicize the political violence in each country, learning the specific chronology of the crisis. We will explore the active relation between revolutionary and counter-revolutionary violence. We will acknowledge the dynamic nature of counter-revolution. We will study the dynamics of conflict on and in an international level. And we will contextualize the fight for human rights within the larger century of revolution in Latin America. To end our overview of how Latin America fits in the history of human rights, I want you to think about Wright's three stages of the human rights revolution from 1945 to 2003. The early post-World War II years. This first stage pertained to a moment when the discussion and establishment of standards for human rights were first declared. Before this moment, rights were business of individual states, and international criticism carried little weight. Key institutions and agreements during this period include the Organization of American States, formed in 1948, which was the first international organization to articulate transnational human rights standards, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also from 1948, which set global standard for human rights for the first time. The second stage is framed between the 1950s and 1970s and emphasizes international agencies and NGOs' adoption of a series of mechanisms designed to monitor individual states' compliance with standards adopted earlier and those to be ratified in the future. These agencies included the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 1959. This agency was charged with developing awareness of human rights, issuing relevant reports, fielding individual complaints, and conducting on-site investigations in any OAS member country. Another was the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights in 1980, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, also in 1980, and Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch were also created. The third stage takes place in the last quarter of the 20th century and is characterized by the enforcement of human rights norms as international law began to be recognized duty not limited by national borders to prosecute violators of human rights, most commonly identified with the International Criminal Court created in 2003. The International Criminal Court works on the basis of two key principles of the international human rights jurisprudence. One, crimes against humanity cannot be amnestied, and the perpetrators of such crimes are subject to universal jurisdiction, which we will discuss on week 5, delving into the topics of transitional justice, truth and reconciliation commissions, as well as memory. As we analyze our case studies, we will discuss the meaning and significance of memory and its production at different moments and by different historical actors. Historian Steve Stern has defined memory as the cultural code word of our times. Quote, "The word has resonance as an imperative not to forget the people destroyed by 20th century regimes of mass cruelty and violence, not to forget the survivors and their rights to repair in the present, not to forget that the architects of state atrocity compounded the harm through denial and cover-up, not to forget truth and accountability for human rights crimes. Above all, memory matters because regimes of atrocity are also crimes of euphemism and misinformation. Misinformation encourages indifference and forgetting. It undermines accountability. In short, memory evokes the moral lesson of human rights and the associated idea of never again." As we conclude, I want you to kind of go back to the guiding questions and see if you can answer what have been considered the origins of human rights, the role of Latin America in the human rights revolution, the stages of the human rights revolutions, and the factors defining revolutionary times in Cold War Latin America.